Me get my recording ready. Wonderful. So thanks for everyone for joining in today. So my name is Nikki Anderson, and I'm joining in from the lands of the Jawa and Gadigal peoples in southeast Queensland. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining in today. I also invite you to acknowledge the lands that you're on today in the chat if you would like to. So today's webinar is on mental illness disclosure and authentic leadership, and it's co-hosted by the UniSQ Disability Network and the Association of Neurodivergent and Disabled Glamour Professionals Australia. So before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to note that we are recording this session, so please feel free to leave your cameras on or off, whatever you prefer, but please remain muted while our speaker is presenting. But feel free to add questions and comments in the chat as we go along, and we will have time for them at the end of the session. And now it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Megan Pozzi. So Megan is an award-winning educator, public speaker, business owner, and researcher focused on creating engaging, accessible, and equitable learning experiences with and for students. She is currently Director, Student Inquiry and Advising at the University of Southern Queensland. And as a former high school drama and English teacher, she has 15 years experience working across the secondary and tertiary education sector. Her work in leading student success initiatives has been featured in academic publications, ABC News and Radio, and Women's Weekly. Outside of work in higher education, Megan is a mental health advocate and speaks on her experiences of perinatal mental illness. So following the birth of her first child, Megan was hospitalised for severe postnatal mental illness, an experience she has now grown to be thankful for and which she is passionate about sharing in pursuit to normalise conversation about mental health. So thank you so much for being here today, Megan, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Nikki and Emilia, and just a big credit to you for your leadership of both the UniSQ Disability Network and also the work you're doing for ANPA, and thank you for being champions and dare I say revolutionaries in this space. So credit to both of you, and thank you so much for thinking of me for this opportunity today. So I'll just start my slides. And thank you, Nikki, for pronouncing my name correctly, because I've got up there that my name, phonetic Megan Pozzi sounds like vegan Aussie. That's because I often get Megan Pozzi and any number of different pronunciations. As Nikki shared, I'm the Director of Student Inquiry and Advising here at University of Southern Queensland, and I'm not sure how many people in the room today are from the higher education sector, but in terms of a position, it's a senior role in the university. I'm 3 down, in the hierarchy, 3 down from the Vice Chancellor. So the Vice Chancellor is like the CEO if anyone's joining from the private sector. And as Nikki's shared, I have had a professional career in education for the last 15 years. And, in my career, I've never had a senior leader disclose as publicly as I have any experience of mental illness. So I don't really have any contemporaries to look to in what I'm doing today. Perhaps there are some out there, and if there are some, I'd love to hear about them. But please be gentle with me, because this is not something that I have seen in my own career, and perhaps you haven't either. So I appreciate your support in making this a safe environment today for everyone here. I'd just like to acknowledge the country that I'm coming to you from today, including the Gadigal, and so I'm on Yagara and Turrbal country today here in Springfield, but University of Southern Queensland has campuses around Queensland, so I'll just acknowledge the Gadigal and Jarowair peoples of Toowoomba, the Yagara and Yugara Turrbal peoples of Springfield and Ipswich, and the Yugarapul people as well, where we also have a campus on Ipswich. The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, Camberwell peoples in Stanthorpe, Yumachi peoples of Geraldton, and Bidjara peoples of Charleville. And they're the keepers of knowledge where UniSQ campuses and hubs have been built and whose customs and cultures continue to nurture the land. And I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging too. So I'm going to do a bit of a presentation. Hopefully it won't take too long. And then I'm open to any and all questions about anything that I touch on. You know, I'm all about that sort of radical kind of authenticity. So don't be shy at the end of the presentation to ask any questions. Before we get started, just a few little thought bubbles. I am going to be talking about my own experience of mental illness, including being hospitalized. So just a trigger warning, if there's anything in the presentation today that you find distressing or upsetting, please look after yourself and leave, or mute me for a while and turn your camera off, whatever you need to do. Just on perinatal mental illness, so just a little bit of education. So my experience of mental illness was in the perinatal period. Perinatal means any period during pregnancy and the sort of 12 months after giving birth. So it's a bit of a misconception about people always think about postnatal after you've had the baby, but it's also during pregnancy. So that's just a little myth busting. And another myth busting is it impacts women and men, and it impacts carers as well. So if you're in a same-sex relationship, you know, the other partner can experience perinatal mental illness. The rates are 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men have an experience of perinatal mental illness. So chances are, if you know someone who has had a child, you know someone who has experienced perinatal mental illness to some degree. And like all things, it's a spectrum. Obviously, what I went through was on the very serious end of the spectrum, but yeah, it impacts a large number of people in various different ways. And it looks like anxiety, depression, rage. It can look like psychosis. It can look like a whole bunch of different presentations. So again, it's not just a blanket kind of experience. Yeah, it doesn't mean you hate your baby. You know, there's a lot of myths we could go into, but anyway, ask me about that in the questions. Just on the term disability, I guess I'm not a person that identifies as having a disability, and because I don't have an ongoing diagnosis of anything. And even at the time when I was extremely unwell, I wouldn't have at that time either identified as having a disability. I would have identified as being extremely unwell. Though I do want to acknowledge that disabilities can be temporary or ongoing. They can be intermittent, they can be chronic, they can be acute, etc. So by definition, I would have had at that time a disability. Though, you know, I sort of think about it as a very serious, well, I don't think about it. It was an extremely serious illness that had a significant impact on my daily functioning and life, and which continues to shape the way that I interact with the world and others. Sort of think about it like, I mean, I've never been bankrupt before, but I imagine, you know, if I'd been bankrupt and had like hit complete rock bottom and then got back to financial security, I would still always be thinking, you know, that experience would shape the way I think about money every day, and I would be worried about being bankrupt again. That's kind of how I sort of relate to my experience of mental illness. My experience only, this isn't generalizable. This is not research. This is just my reflection. So please take it as such. There's probably another talk that could happen that's separate to this talk around careers by happenstance, and how you can use unplanned events and sometimes unfortunate events to create new opportunities for yourself. So there'll be a bit of that you might pick up coming through, but that's probably a separate conversation around career development. Today, I'm just going to keep the focus on sort of leadership. And one of my values in life is fun. It always has been. Before I was sick, it was fun. And what that means is I tend to make a lot of jokes and quips and things like that. Please don't interpret that as me minimizing or trivializing my experience of mental illness or anyone else's experience of mental illness. It's simply me living out of my values, and I have found fun and joking and humor, it's a good sign that I'm doing well. It's a good sign I'm living out of my values, and it's very therapeutic having a laugh as well. So one of my catch cries is I take everything seriously, but not solemnly. So I'm dead serious about everything I'm talking about. If I make a joke, it doesn't mean that I'm not serious. And I know there's people in the room who know me who will know that to be true, but I just want to say it because I know there's strangers in the room and I don't want you to think like. So here's a little bit of background about me. You can see there on fun as a value, I was Captain Starlight so there's a picture there. If anyone's any vision impairments, there's a picture there of me in like a superhero costume standing next to Darth Vader doing a salute. So my job for 4 years prior to getting into education was I worked for the Starlight Children's Foundation as Captain Starlight, providing like diversional therapy to seriously ill, disabled, and chronically unwell children, injured children and their families. And that was all around like the power of distraction, fun, humor in supporting people and their families to be well. So that's an interesting thing. But all the rest of the photos, I guess what it puts to you is that, if you looked at my life from the outside, you'd think that I'm a person that's like doing pretty well at life. I've done a TED talk, I've got to go all around the world speaking. I've studied at MIT. Down the bottom there's a picture of me holding some boxes. I've ran a very successful business for 3 years. There's a picture there of me running a marathon. I won 3-minute thesis. So like you could get a picture of me as someone who has a lot of things really going my way and things going really well. And that's true. Like there's a lot of things in my life that I've had a lot of highlights in my life. And I put this photo in there down the bottom right. There's a picture of my family and I on a recent ski holiday that I put on Instagram. And one of my friends, which I just thought was so funny, put a comment on it and says, "Why does this look like a picture of the royal family on holiday?" Which I just thought was so funny. My friend having a dig at me. But from the outside, you would see like things are looking pretty, like you're just winning at life, you're kicking goals, you're getting all these things, because it's the highlights reel that you would see on social media. And, I'm not a person that does things by halves. And because I'm not a person that does things by halves, the lowlights reel of my life is just as spectacular as the highlights reel. But that's not the stuff that you see on LinkedIn or social media, etc. So, if you Googled me, you would see a whole bunch of these highlights and things like that. But you wouldn't see a whole bunch of the other, to be frank, shit that has gone on behind the scenes. So let me tell you a little bit more about that and give you a bit of a timeline to set up some context here. So in 2016, so this is a timeline you can see here. It spans from May 2017 to November 2023. So it's a 6-year timeline, which is important. I became pregnant in 2016. I had experienced infertility for about 3 years prior to that. I thought I was never going to become pregnant. I'd been told that it was unlikely that I would become pregnant. I had actually given up on becoming pregnant. So I became pregnant by complete surprise. And in May 2017, I had my daughter. That was in late May. So I was on maternity leave at that point from my job. And quickly after, I became acutely and very seriously unwell with a whole host of various symptoms where basically I became so unwell that I was involuntarily hospitalized in a mental health unit. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology, that is when you are so unwell that your treating practitioners determine that you are at harm to yourself or others, and they take all of your rights away from you, and you get basically committed to a mental health unit. and you don't have any say over your treatment. You have to basically, if they tell you you're taking this medication, that's you're taking that medication. You don't have choice. There's a Mental Health Act and things, there's powers underneath that. So this is all my way of saying it was extremely serious, right? So I was in this mental health unit, fortunate to have access to private health, and went into a special mother-baby unit. So I had my baby with me that whole time. I was in that mental health unit for 4-ish weeks. I think it was about 4.5 weeks. My memory of that time is patchy because I was heavily sedated for my own health. So then I got out of the mental health unit, and while I was on maternity leave, I lost my job in a restructure that happened at my work. And I had to reapply for new roles. So here I was with this new baby. I'd had complete life upheaval, had been in a mental health unit. Then I lost my job. And I had to then write job applications and interview for jobs so that I had a job to go back to at the end of my maternity leave. Nobody at my workplace knew what I had gone through. So I was sort of on the phone hearing like, yes, unfortunately, we're, going along with it. Fortunately, I got a new job. So in May 2018, a year later, I went back to work. And I went back to work full-time in May 2018. So I carried on. No one was any the wiser. The only people who knew what I had been through was family and some close friends. Then in November 2019, my son was born. Great timing, as everyone would point out. Like the first time I went on maternity leave, there was a giant restructure where everyone lost their jobs. The second time I went on maternity leave, COVID happened a few months into it. So everyone was like, Megan, you can't go on maternity leave again. Everything terrible happens when you go away. So I was on a maternity leave again. Now, by this point, it was sort of 3 years on, and I was doing really well. I felt like I hadn't had any relapse. I was feeling healthy. I was feeling like in a good place. And I decided, quite selfishly, that there would be benefit in me sharing my story with others. So, there's a research base that says that when you start talking about what you've been through, there's benefits for you in sharing, and there's benefits for other people in hearing what you're talking about. And I was it was COVID. I was bored at home on maternity leave, and I just decided I'm going to start doing some advocacy. And so I decided to start a business during COVID. And the business was all around sharing my story and doing fundraising for perinatal mental illness. And if you watch the TED Talk, you'll hear more about what that involved, but I won't go into that here. So as part of that, I decided, okay, I'm going to have to make this disclosure because it's part of launching this business. I was on maternity leave. I made a disclosure. I knew that I had work colleagues on my social media at the time. So I knew my work colleagues would have been probably back at work or working from home and then talking oh, have you seen what Megan's doing? Megan's starting this business, blah, blah, blah. So I knew they would have been talking. So then I went back to work in November 2020 after having launched the business while I was on maternity leave. And I basically just ripped the Band-Aid off because I knew people would have seen it and I said, look, this has happened. I've started this business. Yes, this happened to me in 2017. Because remembering these people had worked with me this whole time without knowing any of this. I'm fine. I'm doing well. Thank you for your care, etc. So that was that initial disclosure then. And so things kind of ticked along as normal. And I was doing a very wise thing of working full-time, running a business on the side. I had 2 small children at home. So I had heaps of free time to live my life. And then July last year, I left my old job and I started a new job here at University of Southern Queensland. And then that was a weird thing because nobody here at my current place of work knew. And I didn't have that long history of having worked with all these people to kind of know whether it would be okay to tell them, like they're brand new to me. But then I decided to sort of wrap up this chapter of my life, because I felt like, yeah, I'm kind of done with running this business. Like, this is a lot on my plate. How am I going to kind of tie this up? I just decided to do a TED talk, and I was very fortunate to get accepted to do the TED talk. And then that was out for the whole. So everyone, it's out there now. If you Google me, you'll see this TED talk, and you'll just see that I've made this disclosure, right? So then that, of course, meant that people at my current place of work could see that TED talk, and there are colleagues here today. So that's the kind of timeline of events of what happened. So here's a little bit of the research then that like underpins this. So I'm just going to talk about a few points from the higher education sector, and a number of these studies are from the UK, but there are some studies emerging in Australia. So we know that mental health in university staff isn't great. There's some suggestion that we have it worse in higher education compared to the general population, and those of us who do work in universities, you know, you'll hear the sort of the jokes about PhD actually stands for permanent head damage and stuff like that. You know, it's kind of a thing that we understand, you know, happens. We know that there's a relationship between staff wellbeing and student wellbeing. On the point of leadership, we know that leadership is actually really important in staff and student wellbeing and fostering safe and supportive environments or otherwise. So it impacts people's experience at work quite significantly, leadership style, and whether or not they want to stay or go. And we also know that leaders are critical factors in whether or not staff decide to disclose any sort of disability, injury, or health condition in the workplace. So these are things we kind of know. And actually, the Australian Mental Health Commission recently released sort of a report card about stats in Australia, which I encourage you to go and have a look at, because it's got a really good like little infographic about the state of play. So here's the buts. And this is one of the things about leadership. So there's some belief that if you're a leader, you have better mental well-being than people who have leadership, that aren't in leadership positions. So that's kind of a weird thing, right? You know, people think that you're just doing better because you're a leader. People don't think that people with mental illness can be leaders. Like, they just don't think that the two are congruent, right? When people think of leaders, they don't think of people with mental illness, even though, you know, you could say you have to be crazy to become a leader because it's so hard and difficult. But anyway. And what we also know is like people in leadership roles, we're just normal people. We have mental health issues just like everyone else. We're no better. We're no different. There's this really interesting study that says that if you are in a position of power or seniority or authority and you disclose something, then people perceive you negatively than if it's just two peers disclosing something to one another. Then there's sort of not that sort of negative connotation. So it's kind of like, okay, if you're a leader, you're kind of, you know, it's difficult to disclose things to people that work with you. But then the catch-22 for the poor leaders in the room, you know, the poor leaders. If you don't disclose things about yourself, people can perceive you as being inauthentic, right? So people can judge you really harshly if you do disclose, and they can also judge you really harshly if you don't disclose enough. So it's like a really tricky space to be in when you're in a leadership role. So here's case in point. I'm mentoring a staff member here at the moment, and here's a little team screenshot where I've shared my TED talk, because the person I'm mentoring shared some things, and I said, I'm just going to show you something, and I sent the TED talk, and then the response is, courageous. Thank you for sharing it with me. I will never have guessed it in a million years. I tend to think management have things always going their way. So there you go. Like that's an interaction that I've had with someone in the workplace that kind of like proves, you know, what I've just said in the research. So look, here I am. I'm a person that's told you all that I've been involuntarily hospitalized for mental illness. I'm in this senior leadership position. I'm a person that's very interested in leadership and the impacts. Whoops, sorry, I don't know why that's on an auto move. So how do I sort of make sense of like my own experience? Like this is a thing that's happened to me. I haven't seen anyone really do it before. How do I make sense of it? And what I would put to you is like the historical or like more traditional approaches to leadership and ways of working, though they might have served us in the past, I would put to you that potentially they aren't serving us in the ways we need them to in the present because of the complexity of the world that we live in, and they're not getting us to where we want or need to be personally or organizationally. And so I think that we need to start thinking about sort of new ways of being. So this is kind of like the question, that the reflection that I've gone on. So in comes authentic leadership. Sorry, I just find this funny because I just Googled like examples of authentic leadership. So here I am comparing myself to Oprah and Martin Luther King and Warren Buffett, right, on this slide. So authentic leadership is a type of leadership. You might have heard of other forms of leadership like transformational, servant, authoritative, charismatic leadership. You know, there's all kinds of leadership frameworks. And I find this is like a helpful framework for unpacking my own experience and what I've gone through. So really, it's about having your inner world and your outer world being in alignment, right? Acting in accordance with your own values and beliefs and being really transparent and open in how you go about the way you work. So one of the things that they say about authentic leaders is there needs to be some kind of trigger event or personal history that actually leads to someone leading in an authentic way. So I'm just going to take you through this framework and I'm just going to analyze my own journey in light of this framework. So you can see there's kind of 4 steps. Steps 1 and 2, self-awareness and unbiased processing. They're things that happen internally, right, in your internal world. And then steps 3 and 4 are around your interactions with the outside world. So that's basically what it is. So the first thing is you have to be self-aware. So when I was extremely unwell, I didn't even know that I was unwell, right? I had no self-awareness that I was even sick and I had a problem, right? So really, that was a very basic step 1 for me in getting some personal insights and general self-awareness was like I had to acknowledge that I was unwell as step 1. And perhaps if you've experienced mental illness before, you'll relate to that, where you just don't think you're sick. You think you're fine. You think what you're experiencing is completely normal. You think everyone else has a problem, whatever, right? So you have to be self-aware. And I guess broadly in the workplace, you would come across people all the time that don't have a level of self-awareness about various things going on for them. So, you know, one of the things for me was just recognizing like, okay, I've got a problem here. And then the next thing that I had to realize was like part of the problem, like I'm sick and part of the problem is me and who I am and how I'm thinking about the world, how I'm interacting with the world, how I'm making sense of my experiences. And so unbiased processing, the second part, that's about just self-regulation. It's about going, okay, I'm getting all this feedback internally and externally, and it's about how do I make sense of that feedback? What do I learn from that feedback? How do I course correct from that feedback? And something that was really helpful for me was I spent a lot of time in therapy. I would go rain, hail, or shine for years in therapy, and I learned a whole bunch of ugly truths about myself doing therapy, but I also learned a whole bunch of tools and skills and frameworks for understanding how to respond when I was confronted with things that were unpleasant, things I didn't like, things that didn't make sense, etc. So I developed a really good toolkit to do that self-regulation and self-reflection. And actually in the workplace, you know, whenever anything goes wrong, and this is probably still my anxiety talking, but whenever anything goes wrong, the first thing I think is, oh my God, what did I do? You know, I always turn inward, like, what have I done here that's contributed to this situation? And I would say that, you know, we would do well if we had a lot more leaders doing that work, right? Asking like, how did I contribute to this mess, instead of going, you know, that blame pointing. Let's go inward first. But anyway, I'll get off my high horse now. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but it's certainly something that I try to model. So you can see here that, you know, I talked before about my decision to disclose because I was wanting to do this advocacy work in my personal life. And when I made that decision to disclose, that's when you would have started seeing things changing in my outer world. And I was my actions were hopefully starting to align with my values and beliefs. So, you know, I had this value about honesty. I had this value about destigmatizing mental health, you know, and then I started doing things that showed that that sort of validated those values, I guess, in the way that I was engaging with the world around me. And so that's when I started sort of talking quite freely and openly about any number of things, you know, in the workplace with my colleagues, etc., about what's going on. So, what did I learn from doing all this? Oh, okay. Here's the most beautiful poem. I would just ask you to read it because you know how I said before about highlights and lowlights? Highlights, real and low. Like I just saw this poem and I just thought, oh my gosh, this is the best poem ever. So it just makes me feel warm in my heart. So just read that poem. So some key learnings was I was so fortunate that I did not have a mental health episode at work, right? It happened to me while I was on maternity leave, and I had the choice to, oh gosh, sorry, there's weird timings on this. Sorry, this is me thinking out loud. I didn't clearly quality check my PowerPoint enough because these things keep skipping and they've clearly got timings on them, which I didn't realize. So I was really fortunate I didn't have a mental health incident at work. It was on maternity leave. So I could keep it to myself. I could have kept it to myself forever, right? And no one could have known about it. So having the ability to disclose voluntarily and on my own terms was critical, right? And it would have been very different if it had happened in the workplace without my, you know, without me having that sense of control over it. I just think that self-awareness piece, as I said before, my view is everybody needs therapy or at least coaching, right? To get that self-awareness piece down. It has been so good. And actually the best work that I've done has happened when I'm doing really well, right? That's been the best thing, the self-awareness piece. And again, this is me like being silly, but you know, sometimes I'm in the workplace and I think to myself, oh my God, how was I the one that ended up in the mental health unit? Like, oh my gosh, like these people need help more than me. So I'm all about the benefits of like therapy and coaching and just like owning and grounding your own stuff and realizing the role that we all play in the environments that we create and are a part of in the workplace and in our personal lives too. Disclosure doesn't equal trust. So right now there's a whole bunch of strangers in this room that I've told this thing to. I don't know you. Okay. So you know, Brene Brown talks a lot about this. You know, vulnerability often precedes trust. So this idea that you have to trust someone or something before you can disclose, I would sort of challenge that notion, as does Brene Brown and other thoughts. So obviously it's important that you feel safe to do so, but disclosing doesn't, for me, mean that I trust you. It's just like part of me living out of my values. And it doesn't create trust. So just like if I'm talking to you and like it comes up, you know, when talking about this, it doesn't mean that you trust me, right? Just because I've told you something. So that's an important part to know. What happened to me was when I disclosed, I had an insane amount of increase in disclosures from colleagues, like insane, both from my direct reports and also other people in the workplace. So if you're someone that's going to disclose whatever, it doesn't have to be mental illness, any kind of personal matter, you need to be prepared that other people will disclose to you. And you would be shocked to know how many other people have had hospitalizations for mental illness. Like, we walk among you. We are everywhere. There are people everywhere that have been hospitalized for mental illness. And the reason I know that is because they all come and tell me that they've been hospitalized, which I don't take any enjoyment in. But how great would it be if everyone just kind of knew, like, this is a thing that happens more often than we think. So that can be hard too, though, obviously, because I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor. So holding space for people when they're just disclosing stuff, you know, that has a load attached to it. Approachability, but so I always get feedback that, oh, you're so approachable. Oh my gosh, Megan, you're like, never had a boss as approachable as you, blah, blah. And that's probably because of this disclosure and because I'm always like, oh my God, I made a mistake. This is horrible. You know, like I'm pretty free about owning things. Like I have to, like I said to my supervisor, like I have to confess something to you. Like I said, I wasn't going to do this thing and then I did it. But what I would say is, and this is something that I'm learning more and more, and which has been easier since I changed jobs, you know, because people disclose things to you, you know, you want to be empathetic and you want to be supportive. But I'm also a leader, right? And we also have to get performance out of our team members. And you have conversations about health and well-being, and they often get caught up or sort of tangled up with conversations about performance. And I think in the past, I've been quite sympathetic to the health and well-being stuff at the expense of having the conversations about performance. And I think I'm getting a lot better at going, I am very sympathetic to what you're going through, but you're also getting paid to do a job, and I need you to perform that job to this standard. And that's something that I'm, you know, always super mindful of. And of course, there's adjustments and things you can make, but we need to hold people to a standard, and people shouldn't be at work if they're unwell. People are so nice. It's really hard to have a bad day. And, you know, I'm just, you know, if I have like a little whatever, people always say, are you okay? Are you sure? Do you need to take a day off? Like, is there anything I can do for you? So I'm totally fine. Like, I'm allowed to have a bad day. It doesn't mean I'm going to end up in a mental health unit again. Yeah, so it can be very difficult to have a bad day without people and then you have to spend the energy like convincing people that you're okay, and it's just a lot of energy. So it's very hard to have a bad day, even though it comes from a good place. And yeah, the reality is it's highly likely that I'm being discriminated against in ways I'm unaware of because of what I'm doing right now and because of my TED Talk. And I will never know. I haven't been openly discriminated against or actively discriminated against. I couldn't point you to something, but because people are people and these things are generally misunderstood, I'm quite confident that I have been discriminated against, even though maybe, I don't know, maybe this is paranoia. Maybe I haven't been. Anyway, but those of us that do have, whether it's a visible disability or where it's kind of known that there's something going on, that's a thing that we wonder about all the time in our interactions with others. And that's not a nice feeling, right? But then the other part of me is like, I actually don't care, because if you're the person doing that, you're not really a person whose respect I want or need, because you're a horrible person and you need to go to therapy. You need to get some work to unpack like what's going on there and why you're acting in this way. So, but that's a reality of the situation. So certainly for me, the pros have outweighed the cons. So the pros of disclosing have outweighed the cons. Though, yeah, I acknowledge that wouldn't have been everyone's experience. All right. So that's the end, but I'm happy to open the floor. Oh, and here's all the references. Oh God, and see there, like there's one there that was in black font instead of purple font. See, this is my anxious brain. I'm like, another mistake. I'm happy to take any questions, feedback, thoughts.
Thank you so much,